Okay, hello. How's everyone doing today? Excellent. Thank you so much for being here today. Thank you to the McCain Institute for hosting this gathering. And a big, big thank you to the 22nd U.S. Deputy Secretary of State, Kurt Campbell, for being here with us. Please join me in welcoming him. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
A
Thanks.
little bit busy for you these days.
It's okay. I had the good fortune. I was a Kissinger fellow here at the McCain Institute, so I'm always thrilled to come back and grateful for the wonderful leadership of Evelyn. And so thank you for having me.
Good to have you back, especially today. There's a lot to talk about. I'm going to revert to my journalistic instincts here and start with the news, really, because this is, I know, an area that you focus on in the Indo-Pacific. And I need to ask for your take on what we're seeing unfold in South Korea. For anyone not following along, which I'm sure you all are, we saw the president there, of course, declare martial law. We saw lawmakers step in to vote that down. He then backed down and revoked the martial law. Lawmakers are now moving to impeach him. Just give us your take on why we're seeing this unfold now and what you think happens next.
Great. Well, thank you. So let me just say, just at the outset, we observed the developments in the ROK, the declaration of martial law, with really grave concern and a deep uncertainty, and obviously that played out very quickly. And I think we were all impressed by the demonstration of the resilience of the ROK, our South Korean partners' democracy, and very clear expressions of the will of the people. I think our overall stance has got to be a deep confidence in the ROK's ability to navigate the way ahead, even with all the uncertainties. And I think the most important message that we can send, there are clearly many questions that need to be answered about what has transpired, but our most important role is to have confidence in the ROK and to stand shoulder to shoulder with the people of Korea, and also to make clear that anyone who would consider or contemplate provocations against the ROK during this moment, that we are absolutely vigilant in maintaining peace and stability, and we will stand with the ROK, and our alliance is absolutely rock solid.
Do you have any better understanding of why President Yoon took this step right now and what you expect to come out of this impeachment move?
So look, there will be a vote Saturday morning, our time. Difficult to make any predictions. We frankly are in the processes of engaging our ROK interlocutors. I think much of what we've learned has been through the news. So I think we're gonna have to wait and see what takes place in terms of the vote, and ultimately, our determination is to support the democratic process, peaceful process inside the ROK.
You mentioned the word uncertainty a lot, so I have to ask, did this catch the U.S. officials by surprise?
It did.
Enough said. I also want to ask you this about news this week with President Biden's visit to Angola, with respect largely to this effort to counter and compete with China, because we saw this major investment announcement in the Lobito corridor, some $600 million in additional funding, which will help to transport and export a lot of those critical minerals we know the U.S. and other Western nations need. We had an expert on the show yesterday who's followed this for years and talked about the dramatic difference between the years and level of investment that China has been putting into nations like Angola versus the U.S., which pales in comparison. How do you look at that? Is the U.S. playing a game of catch-up here, and was disengaging for all those years a mistake?
So, first of all, I think I'd question some of those parameters. We have a tendency to underestimate the nature of our programs and our engagements in places like Africa, some of what we have done has been just deeply significant on the continent. President Bush's PEPFAR program has had a dramatic impact, positive impact on the public health of populations, not just across Africa, but other parts of the developing world. We have long-standing, deep relations with large number of African countries, an important trade relationship between Africa and the United States. And I would also say that, there's a tendency to look at the Chinese Belt and Road program and others and say, gee, look, what do we have to show? The collective efforts of the DFC and the Millennial Challenge Corporation and USAID bring very substantial projects and engagements to all of Africa. But I will also say that we often invest in different things than sometimes China does. We're more focused on institutions, on the political welfare of people, and perhaps a little bit less on certain kinds of major big infrastructure projects. I do acknowledge that we need to do better here, but I would say I'm thrilled that the president was able to go here at the last Angola and to highlight the enormous progress that is made around the Lobito corridor. But you see other engagements, the state visit with Kenya. Mm-hmm. I do think our position is critical in Africa, and it is important to underscore, even though we've got pressing and critical foreign policy challenges globally, that our enduring presence and engagements in places like Africa. I've worked a lot on the Pacific, that our game, we've stepped up considerably, and we need to keep it there.
Some of the experts we talked to about this said, in looking forward, nations like Angola and others don't have to make a choice about who they ally with, who they work with. They can continue to work with both China and the U.S., but then that also means that the U.S. has to cooperate with China on some of these projects. Do you see it that way? Do you agree with that?
So look, I do want to acknowledge that the overriding character of our relationship with China is competitive. Mm-hmm. But that does not mean that there aren't areas, I should not double negative, there are areas where the United States and China can and should be prepared to work together. I think that there are possibilities in development. We do have different visions and different approaches. I think we tend to be more transparent, more open. We try to engage in competitive processes. Sometimes China's engagements are behind the scenes and involve elite capture, bringing in Chinese workers to complete projects. We try to invest more in developing local capacity. But that being said, there are a number of areas in climate change and across the board where the United States and China can and should work together. I would say, I think our dominant goal in many of these places is to work more closely with like-minded partners. Mm-hmm. And so what you are seeing is a number of countries engaging more deeply. For instance, we're talking about Africa. India's role in Africa, much more significant than just a few decades back. Traditional partners who have long-standing interests in the region from Europe, also that coordination and cooperation is important. And that's where the lion's share of our focus has been, is to work with allies and partners on joint development efforts, whether they are in the Pacific or Africa or elsewhere.
If we can take a huge step back for just a moment to talk about this moment that we're in, which is the transition from one administration to another, and a time when there are two hot wars at least unfolding. We're seeing democratic backsliding in a number of nations, and fair to say, I think, an outgoing president with one specific worldview and an incoming president with a very different kind of worldview. You've written a book on transitions. You know a thing or two about what's at stake here. Can you talk a little bit about how concerned you are about this point in time, this transition from one administration to another, given the many issues you've been dealing with from your post?
Yeah. So look, you put your finger on it. The world is an extraordinarily dynamic place. Huge challenges in the Indo-Pacific, in Europe, with Ukraine, obviously in the Middle East, and you talked about the enduring challenges that are playing out in places like Africa. So you're absolutely correct that the stakes could not be higher. My book was really about this process that takes place between an election in November and the early stages of a new government and those months that take place in between. I would say that the Biden administration is completely committed to do everything possible to hand over power, to share as much information and perspective, and provide whatever wherewithal we can to enable the Trump administration to hit the ground running. I think there are signs in the last couple of days that some of the documents and the procedures that are necessary for this kind of orderly and smooth transition, I think the Trump team are taking those steps, and I just want to underscore we're committed to that. This is a part of the democratic process in the United States, and we have to embrace it and engage appropriately.
Can you give us a sense from where you sit of how that's going so far, that transition process? I mean, as you mentioned, that the documentation for the Memorandum of Understanding was just signed on Tuesday so that the Department of Justice can begin background checks on some of the incoming administration members. That's late by a lot of standards. So have you been able to speak to your incoming counterparts?
I don't think like the deputy, I don't think that position has been decided yet, at least from what we've seen. There have been appropriate conversations with Secretary of State nominee Senator Rubio. He has a long and distinguished record in the Senate and a powerful voice for democracy and very clear, I think, strong views on the American position in the world, and he's played a leading role on the Indo-Pacific. I've very much welcomed his counsel and have engaged with him actively over the years. I think we have high confidence that he will be an extraordinarily successful Secretary of State, and we will do everything possible to take the necessary steps to give him what information might be valuable as he prepares to take on this new and important role.
It's fair to say I think he's staked out a much more aggressive approach when it comes to a few nations, in particular to China, Iran, Venezuela. He's talked about the need for a tougher approach from the incoming administration to some of those nations. Can you give us a sense of what you think that tougher approach could look like? What kinds of questions you hope he's asked during confirmation hearings?
Those are great questions. I think and I would just add to them, he's also been very firm about the United States' need to stand with Ukraine. Mm-hmm. And so I think he comes out of the broad tradition of a muscular Republican foreign policy that is based on values and strategic interests. I very much support that and welcome that going forward. Yeah, I will say, one of the challenges, what happens normally in elections is that there are party platforms, that issues are debated actively at conventions. I think one of the things that has happened this time around, there's been remarkably little of that. And so we really don't know some of the fundamental, kind of policy priorities of President Trump. And so I think there's likely to be some active debates as they settle in. I think probably that's to be expected. I myself am very much comforted by the long-standing positions that Senator Rubio has taken. But more than anything else, it's that he I think rejects the idea of withdrawing back into the United States, that being forward deployed and engaged is the best possible stance for the United States, and he also has demonstrated an acknowledgement of the importance of allies and partners. And I think one of the things that the President Biden and his team have done has invested in many of those relationships, whether they are in Europe or the Indo-Pacific. And I think some of those ties, some of them new and innovative, like AUKUS and the Quad, I think the hope is that they will be continued in a new administration.
I want to ask you about the Quad in just a moment, but to follow up on something you mentioned about Senator Rubio, because he was among those who co-sponsored legislation to stop any president from pulling the U.S. out of NATO without Congress's approval, because he threatened to do so, obviously. How do you look at that? How do you see an incoming President Trump interacting with NATO, and what are your concerns about the future of that alliance?
So if I can just say, look, I earlier in my career, I'd done a little work on NATO when I was much younger. Most of what I've worked on in the last, 25 or 30 years has been in the Indo-Pacific. I make no apologies for that. It's an area that I've been very focused on. But in my recent capacities, both in the White House and now at the State Department, part of my responsibilities are to engage more deeply with Europe about the Indo-Pacific, and now on broader issues that are deeply significant to European countries. In those capacities, in those assignments, I've had the good fortune to work extensively with NATO. And I have to just say, for those who don't have a daily experience, it is a marvel, and it is an incredible organization and institution and achievement. And the fact that so many countries are able to align and work in common purpose is just a remarkable achievement. I think it's one of the proudest things that the United States has ever been involved in. And I don't say this in any partisan way. If you go to NATO headquarters and just see that process of integration and working through problems together, it's remarkable. And so my hope is that any incoming team will come to recognize the way Senator Rubio does, the remarkable value added, the multiplier effect that NATO has in supporting our security and magnifying our influence. And I believe these transatlantic ties are key to who we are as a people and to American purpose on the global stage. And so I'm confident that there are going to be loud, persistent, and determined voices in the Republican Party that will double down on that Reagan and sort of long-standing Republican support for a strong and durable NATO.
You mentioned the strengthening of some of those Indo-Pacific alliances, among them the Quad, which includes India. And I wanted to ask you about that, as we've seen tensions with China rising and intensifying of security and economic ties with these other nations. But I know there were some strains between the U.S. and India, in particular after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, India's decision to continue buying discounted fuel from Russia. Although I saw earlier this week it was reported now that India has now sharply reduced its purchases of military weapons from Russia, is now buying more from Western suppliers. So are we seeing a shift in some kind when it comes to India's approach to move from the east to the west? Is that indicative of something else?
Well, first of all, I very much appreciate the question. And if you asked me, like, what would be, among or the most important partners for the United States going forward, for me, I would put India at the top of that list. Now, that might surprise some folks, but the fact is this is now the largest country in the world, democratic, incredible expressions of democracy. Indian foreign policy is bending, is aligning more with, I think, areas of common purpose of the United States. We see that mostly in the Indo-Pacific, but we've been able to undertake remarkable arenas of cooperation in space, in technology, in particular in education. You will have seen most recently that the largest number of foreign students in the United States come from India. The sense of the strength of the diaspora, the connectivity between our two societies is remarkable. And I think increasingly India sees its future more, it's a great power. So it has its own unique views. They will never be an absolute, kind of ally with the United States. They treasure their independence and their sense of ability to act as a great power on the global stage. But they are working much more closely with us in intelligence, in military issues, again, people to people. I am very much encouraged with the broad trends and contours of U.S.-Indian relations.
Just to follow up on Ukraine as it relates to areas that you've focused on, though, because I should mention when I was in Ukraine, interviewed President Zelensky earlier this year, one of the issues that was raised both from officials around him, the president himself, also officials on various frontline areas that I visited, was for all the support, weapons supplies, et cetera, manpower was a huge issue. And this development we've now seen on the war front with Russia deploying North Korean troops on the ground into held areas in Ukraine. Tell us how you look at that, what it says about Russia's view right now, what it says about the state of the war, and also the future of the war that Secretary Blinken seemed to indicate would last at least another year.
So look, it's hard to predict what's going to go on in any future conflict. I will say that if you look at the role of two countries in supporting Russia on the battlefield, one, China supporting Russia's defense industrial base with deep and sustained efforts associated with their military industrial base. And then now North Korea providing troops and weaponry, long-range missiles and artillery shells and a variety of other things. These are significant and, in my view, dangerous interventions into an already difficult set of circumstances that Ukraine is facing. It is absolutely essential that the United States and Europe stand firmly with Ukraine during its time of need. I do believe that what we've seen from North Korea is a step up in their willingness to take risks on the global stage, and we have to be unmistakable and firm in our opposition to that.
Once again, taking a slightly look back, a big step back here as we close out the conversation, we're at this moment, both in American history but also global history, of democratic backsliding. And experts seem to note, the studies seem to show that it's not that threats to democracy are necessarily emerging through coups or civil wars, though we are seeing some of that, but it's increasingly from autocratic or autocratic-leaning leaders who use and leverage and manipulate democratic institutions to then consolidate power. And we're seeing signs of that here in the US as well. I wonder, from your view, how you look at that, how you've seen that happen here, why you think it's happened here, and what it takes to reverse it.
So look, I'm in the business of foreign policy, and I'm still in government, and so it's not generally the case that we comment a lot on some of the specific questions that you've raised. And the truth is, as I indicated, I'm very deeply supportive of a orderly, effective transition, and I think we can only but wish the Trump administration well on the global stage, and the hopes that he will conduct his affairs in a way that is deeply consistent with American democracy and the Constitution. look, there's so much research that's being done about why we've seen so many changes and challenges to governments basically since COVID. And some would suggest that the COVID lockdowns were, challenging to domestic institutions globally. Others would say that really unhappiness with inflation has had a big impact, and I think we've also seen movements globally about concern over immigration. There are a variety of factors that come to play. All I can tell you is that I think there is a very strong commitment in the United States to the rule of law, and I'm confident that that will be demonstrated and expressed in a number of ways in the time ahead. And so I think we have to look at this as part of a process. And it's President Obama once said, like, the course and the map to the future is often a winding one, and I intend to run through the tape and do everything I can to support an active and purposeful American role on the global stage, and I'm very proud of that.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Deputy Secretary of State Kurt Campbell. Thank you, sir. Appreciate your time. Thank you.